The document was 43 pages long. I remember that detail precisely because I counted them. Twice. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and the light through the study window was the color of old copper, and I sat there at my drafting desk with this thing in my hands, 43 pages, Courier font, double-spaced, bound with a single black binder clip, and I felt, above all else, a deep and architectural calm. The cover page read, Prenuptial Agreement, Harrington Webb, prepared by Whitmore and Associates. The date was 6 weeks before our wedding. Page 11 was the one that mattered. Clause 14b, subsection 3. I will not quote it in full, but the essential meaning, stripped of its legal scaffolding, was this. In the event of dissolution of the marriage, Marcus Webb would retain only assets held exclusively in his name prior to the date of marriage, less any liabilities assumed during the union, and would make no claim upon the Harrington Family Trust, its subsidiaries, or any jointly titled property regardless of financial contribution. In plain language, if this marriage ended, I would walk away with my car, my drafting table, and whatever was in my personal bank account on the day we said our vows. They had designed a document to leave me with nothing. What Gerald Harrington, his lawyer, his daughter, and every one of her family's advisors did not know, what nobody in that family knew, what almost nobody in the world knew, was what was sitting in my accounts on that exact date. My name is Marcus Webb. I am 41 years old. I am an architect. And on the morning that prenup arrived at my office via courier, the verified balance across my personal holdings, investment accounts, and the licensing trust I had spent 11 years building quietly and alone stood at $347 million. They thought they were protecting their money from me. They had no idea. Before we go further into Marcus's story, we'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. These stories have a way of traveling to the most extraordinary places, and it always means something to us to hear from you. Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you're finding value in what you see, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories just like this one. Now let's return to Marcus Webb, 6 weeks before his wedding, holding a document that its authors believed was a trap. They were right. They had simply sprung it on the wrong man. I should tell you about Celeste before I tell you about what she became. I met her at an architecture symposium in Edinburgh 7 years ago. She was there as the guest of a property developer her father was courting. She had no particular interest in architecture herself. She told me later with a laugh that I found disarming because at least it was honest. She was wearing a deep green dress and carrying a glass of white wine she hadn't touched. And when we were introduced by a mutual colleague, she looked at me with a kind of frank, unhurried attention that I was not used to from beautiful women. We talked for 3 hours about the city, about the way buildings hold memory, about her childhood in a house so large and formal that she had eaten dinner as a child in near silence every night, cutlery clicking against china, nobody quite sure what to say to each other. She made that sound sad rather than impressive, which I respected. She asked me questions and then actually listened to the answers. I fell in love with the woman I met that night in Edinburgh. I want to be precise about that. I fell in love with her curiosity, her self-deprecating wit, her apparent weariness with the world she had been raised in. She seemed to me like someone trying to outrun the worst of her inheritance. I know now that she was not outrunning it. She was simply on holiday from it. We dated for 2 years. I proposed on a rain-gray morning on the top of Arthur's Seat. No restaurant, no audience, no photographer standing 40 meters away with a telephoto lens. Just the two of us and the wind and a ring I had designed myself, because that is how I think about everything worth building, from the foundation upward, nothing borrowed, nothing performed. She said yes. She cried. I believed every tear. The engagement lasted 8 months. The Celeste I had known in Edinburgh was still present for most of them. But something shifted when the wedding planning began in earnest and her family became the dominant gravitational force. The venue had to be the Harrington estate in Wiltshire. The guest list had to include people I had never met and did not particularly want to meet. The flowers had to come from a specific florist in Chelsea whose waiting list was 18 months long. Each decision was made with a casual certainty that my preferences were not a primary input. I absorbed it. I loved her. I thought the marriage itself would be different from the wedding. Then the prenup arrived. And I began very quietly to understand the structure I had walked into. The prenup was not the first sign. It was the first confirmation. The first sign had come 4 weeks earlier on an unremarkable Wednesday afternoon. I had returned to the flat we shared in Marylebone earlier than expected. A site meeting had ended 40 minutes ahead of schedule, and I had walked home rather than hailing a cab because the October air was clean and sharp, and I needed to think through a structural problem on a commission I was developing. Celeste was on the phone in the kitchen. The door was 3/4 closed. I was not eavesdropping. I simply hadn't announced myself yet, and her voice carried. She was talking to her brother, Dominic. I caught the conversation midstream. She was explaining something with the patient, slightly irritated tone of someone who has made the same point before. The words I remember verbatim because some words do not leave you. Daddy's solicitor is already on it. The prenup covers everything. By the time it's done, Marcus can keep his pencils and that ridiculous oak desk and absolutely nothing else. Whatever he's earning on those little commissions of his, it stays ring-fenced away from our assets. That's the whole point. A pause, then Dominic's response, audible through the phone. Does he know, Celeste? He'll sign it. He always does what he's asked. That's rather the point of him. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. I could see the kitchen from where I stood, the clean marble counter, the copper pots hanging in a row, the view of the garden below, everything familiar, everything suddenly belonging to a different story than the one I had believed I was living. I set my bag down quietly. I walked back to the front door. I opened it and closed it again, louder this time. Marcus, she called from the kitchen, her voice warm, unhurried. It's me, I said. Meeting ended early. She appeared in the doorway, phone gone, a smile in place. Wonderful, I'll put the kettle on. I watched her fill the kettle at the sink. I watched her in the way you watch a building you are about to survey, looking for the faults in the foundation, the cracks that run deeper than the plaster. The pain was there, but it did not overwhelm. It crystallized. It hardened into something precise and purposeful and very, very cold. I had a decision to make. I could walk away now. I could end it quietly and save us both the theater. Or I could do what I had always done when I encountered a structure with a fatal flaw buried deep in its architecture. I could document everything. I could wait for the load-bearing moment, and I could let it fall under its own weight. I chose the second option. I went to the kitchen. I drank my tea. I told her about the site meeting. I said nothing about the phone call, and the next morning I called my solicitor. What followed was 6 weeks. 6 weeks of watching the Harrington family operate at full capacity, fully convinced that they were the architects of everything and that I was, at most, a pleasant structural detail in their larger plan. I kept a record not out of bitterness, out of professional habit. I am an architect. I document everything. I noted each incident the way I note a defect on a survey, date, location, exact words. I wrote them in a slim gray moleskine I kept in the inner pocket of my briefcase. And every evening I also checked the private portal that connected to the trust accounts. The balance never shrank. I drew a kind of architectural comfort from that. Gerald Harrington hosted dinner at his estate in Wiltshire every third Thursday without exception. These were not casual family meals. They were performances carefully staged, with Gerald at the head of a table that seated 14 and a seating arrangement that communicated, silently and precisely, the social hierarchy of everyone present. I was always seated at Gerald's left. Celeste's ex-boyfriend from university, a hedge fund manager named Sebastian, who appeared to have a standing invitation despite the fact that Celeste and I were 6 weeks from our wedding, was always seated at Gerald's right. I noted this. I wrote nothing about it. I simply filed it. On this particular Thursday, the conversation turned to the new Riverside development that was being proposed in the city. Gerald had opinions. Gerald always had opinions, delivered in the slow, authoritative baritone of a man who had never once considered that he might be wrong. The problem with architects today, he said, reaching for his wine glass without looking at me, is that they have ideas and no grasp of capital. They design beautiful things and then expect other people to fund them. It's a servile profession masquerading as a creative one. A small laugh ran around the table. Celeste looked at her plate. I said, "Some of us manage both." Gerald looked at me for the first time that evening. His expression was that of a man mildly surprised to find that a piece of furniture had spoken. "Yes," he said pleasantly. "I'm sure you do." He turned back to Sebastian. I picked up my fork. I took a sip of water. Under the table, my right hand moved to the inner pocket of my jacket. My fingers found the slim rectangular weight of a matte black Rotring 600 drafting pencil, 340 grams, brushed aluminum, balanced to the millimeter. I had been carrying it for 11 years. I had used it to sketch the first conceptual drawings of the framework that had made me everything I was. Its cool, solid weight was a form of architecture in itself. I held it for 4 seconds. Then I released it and finished my lamb and said nothing further for the rest of the evening. The meeting was held at Whitmore and Associates on a Friday morning. Gerald's solicitor, a thin man named Clive in a suit that cost considerably more than its owner's warmth, presented the 43 pages with the professional neutrality of someone depositing a document that he considered already concluded. Gerald was present, Dominic was present, Celeste was present. I had not been told they would all be there. This, I noted later, was deliberate. The audience was meant to make me feel outnumbered. "It's entirely standard," Gerald said when I had been given a few minutes to page through it. "Every Harrington marriage involves one. It is a formality." Dominic, who was 31 and had the particular cruelty of someone who has never once faced a consequence, leaned back in his chair with a small smile. "Think of it as a business arrangement, mate. Keeps things clean." Celeste said nothing. I looked at Clause 14b. I looked at the figure that represented my allowable exit package. I looked at Gerald. "I'll need my own solicitor to review it," I said. Gerald's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes contracted very slightly. "Of course, take the week. We'd like it signed by the following Friday." "I understand," I said. On the way out, Dominic caught up with me in the corridor. He had the easy, loose-limbed walk of a man who has never had to hurry for anything in his life. "Don't read too much into it," he said, not unkindly, the not unkindness being somehow worse than open hostility. "You're marrying into a considerable family. Daddy just wants to know the foundations are sound. You understand foundations, right? Being an architect and all." He laughed at his own joke. I smiled. "I understand foundations very well," I said. I walked to the lift. I pressed the button for the ground floor. I stood very still as the doors closed, my right hand in my jacket pocket, my fingers around the rotring. $347 million. They wanted to protect their money from me. My solicitor, a precise and rather magnificent woman named Helen Park, had reviewed the prenup within 48 hours and called me with a summary that can be condensed as follows. It was not merely comprehensive, it was aggressive. Clause 14b was not standard. It had been written by someone who had done significant research into my publicly known income and had designed the document to extract maximum asset protection with minimum legal vulnerability. Whoever had drafted it, Helen said, had assumed they were dealing with a man of modest means whose primary financial exposure was a professional salary and a pension. They had not done enough research. While Helen began her counter-review, I became aware of what was being said about me in the Harrington family group chat. Celeste had left her phone on the kitchen island one morning. A message preview was visible on the locked screen before it dimmed. I did not read her phone. I did not need to. The preview was sufficient. It was from Dominic. It read, "Has the architect signed his lovely little life away yet?" Faced with tears of joy, I noted the time, 8:47 am. I noted the word lovely. I noted the emoji. Later that same day, Celeste's mother, Eleanor, a soft-spoken, fine-boned woman who had always been quietly kind to me and who I believe was the only member of that family capable of genuine feeling, called me separately on my mobile while Celeste was at a dress fitting. "Marcus," she said, and there was something careful and apologetic in her voice, "I want you to know that the prenup was not my idea. I want you to know that." I said, "I know, Eleanor, thank you. I think you're a good man," she said. "I've always thought so." There was a pause. Something in her voice suggested she wanted to say more. She did not. "Take care of yourself," she said, and ended the call. I held the phone for a moment. Eleanor was not a villain. Eleanor was a woman who had lived inside a structure not of her making for so long that dismantling it was beyond her. I filed her separately in my mind, in a different category from the rest. The engagement party was held at the Harrington Townhouse in Kensington. 112 guests. Catering from a firm that had previously handled a royal garden party, a jazz quartet in the drawing room. The kind of event that announces itself before you walk through the door. I wore a charcoal suit I had owned for 4 years. I was offered nothing newer. I noticed this. Gerald gave a toast at 9:15. He was good at toasts, practiced, warm on the surface, lapidary. He spoke about Celeste for 4 minutes with evident pride. He spoke about the Harrington family legacy, the properties, the history, the stewardship of something important and enduring. He spoke about me for 43 seconds. I counted. "Marcus," he said in the measured tone of a man reviewing a planning application, "is a steady and decent individual, a man of modest ambitions and genuine commitment. A good captain, I'm sure, for calmer seas. We welcome him." He raised his glass. 112 people raised theirs. Celeste squeezed my hand. She was smiling at her father, and the smile was not the complicated, apologetic smile of a woman who has just watched someone she loves be publicly diminished. It was easy and proud and entirely comfortable, a man of modest ambitions. I drank my champagne. Later, near midnight, I found myself briefly alone with Sebastian at the drinks table. He was on his third scotch and had apparently decided that we were now friends. "No hard feelings about all this, I hope," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the party, at nothing specific and everything general. "None," I said. "Good man," he clapped me on the shoulder. "She'll be well taken care of. The Harringtons look after their own. And the prenup, honestly, it's a kindness. Keeps things simple if it all goes wrong, which it won't," he added quickly and without conviction. Obviously, he walked away. I watched him go. I thought about the Meridian framework. I thought about the licensing agreements signed in Singapore, in Zurich, in Seoul. I thought about the trust account balance, which had not been a secret by design or by strategy, but simply because I do not perform my life for audiences. And I thought the prenup had arrived. I had had it reviewed. My solicitor had drafted a counterproposal, and now it was time to decide what I was actually going to do. The Meridian framework had begun as a theoretical problem. I had been 26 years old, working 70 hours a week as a junior architect at a mid-sized London firm, designing exactly the kind of structures I was told to design and thinking, in the margins of every brief, about a different problem entirely. How buildings fail, not structurally, systemically. Most buildings fail not because their load-bearing walls collapse, but because the human systems inside them, the heating, the water, the data, the movement of people, are designed in isolation from each other, as though each system exists in a separate universe. The result is buildings that cost 2, 3, 4 times more to operate than they should, that generate waste at every juncture, and that are practically impossible to adapt when the world around them changes. I spent 3 years developing a solution, not a building, a framework. A proprietary system for integrated structural systems design that allowed architects and engineers to model a building's entire operational life cycle from the first sketch, identifying systemic conflicts before a single beam was ordered. I called it the Meridian Framework. The name came from the meridian line, the fixed point from which all measurements are taken. Every structure needs one. I filed the first patents at 29. I incorporated the trust at 31 on the advice of a copyright attorney named Arthur Vance, who was the only person outside of my solicitor who knew the full picture. By the time I met Celeste in Edinburgh, the Meridian Framework had been licensed to 47 firms across 14 countries. By the time she asked me to sign a prenup designed to leave me with nothing, it had been licensed to 112 firms across 29 countries. The royalty income alone was running at $4.8 million per quarter. The night after the engagement party, I sat alone in my study, not the flat in Marylebone, but the studio flat I had kept in Clerkenwell since I was 27, which Celeste did not know existed, and which was registered in a holding company name that no casual search would connect to me, and I opened the trust portal on my laptop. The current verified balance, including the Singapore disbursement that had cleared 48 hours earlier, was $349,241,000. The number sat on the screen in clean gray numerals against a white background. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about Gerald's toast, a man of modest ambitions. I thought about Dominic's WhatsApp message. Has the architect signed his lovely little life away yet? I thought about Celeste's voice through the kitchen door. He always does what he's asked. That's rather the point of him. I took the rotring from my pocket and placed it on the desk beside the laptop. I looked at both of them for a moment, the screen and the pencil. One visible, one invisible, one the tool, one the proof. Then I picked up my phone and called Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance was 61. A copyright and intellectual property attorney who had spent 30 years at the intersection of creative work and enormous money. He was the kind of lawyer who wore open-collar shirts to meetings that other people wore ties to, and who had the peculiar confidence of a man who has never once needed to perform authority, because the authority was simply, quietly, always there. He had been my solicitor since I was 29. He had reviewed every patent, structured every licensing agreement, incorporated the trust, and managed every jurisdiction we operated in. He was the only person alive who knew the full architecture of my financial life. He answered on the second ring despite the fact that it was 11:47 at night. "I wondered when you'd call," he said. "You've seen the prenup? Helen forwarded it to me this morning. Marcus," a pause, "have they done any research at all?" "Apparently not. Clause 14 sub B, they've essentially written a document designed to prevent you from claiming their money." Which is extraordinary because, I know, I said, a long pause on the line. Then Arthur said in the measured, slightly amused voice of a man who has witnessed a great deal of human folly and has long since made his peace with it. What would you like to do? I'm going to sign it, I said. Silence, you're going to sign it. Their version exactly as written. Another pause, then quietly, Marcus, if you sign that document as written and the marriage ends, you walk away with your car and your oak desk. I know, and you're comfortable with that, Arthur, I said. What are the exact assets held in my name prior to the date of marriage? A beat. Then I heard him inhale slowly. Everything in the trust, he said. The Meridian framework, the patents, the licensing royalties, the Singapore accounts. The Swiss accounts, the sole royalty agreement, the property holdings in the corporate name, all of it, all premarital, all exclusively in your name or your holding structures. Exactly as written, I said. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a man reconfiguring his understanding of a situation. They've protected you from their money, Arthur said slowly, and left your money entirely untouched. Yes, and they don't know about any of it. No, another pause. When Arthur spoke again, there was something I rarely heard in his voice, genuine admiration. Well, he said, that's a cleanly designed structure, Marcus, I'll give you that. I'll need you at the end of it, I said. When the time comes, tell me where and when, he said. I'll be there. I signed the prenup on a Friday morning, 11 days before the wedding. I signed it with the Rotring 600 drafting pencil, which is not the expected instrument for a legal document, but which Clive the solicitor did not object to, and which I used because I had decided that the object that had been present through all of it should be present for this too. Gerald received a copy within the hour. I was told later that he had set it on his desk and looked at it for a long moment before saying simply, "Good, that's settled then." Dominic sent a message to the family group chat that I was not in but which was later described to me. It read, he signed it, face with tears of joy like a lamb, Christmas has come early boys. I got married on the second Saturday of November in a church in Wiltshire in front of 214 people, most of whom I had met fewer than 3 times. Celeste was radiant, I mean that without irony. She was the most beautiful person in the room, and she looked at me during the vows with something that seemed, for those 4 minutes, entirely real. I do not know what she felt. I know what I felt, the particular grief of a man who loved someone who did not exist. We returned from our honeymoon, 10 days in the Maldives, the hotel chosen by Celeste, the bill paid by Gerald, on a Sunday evening. The following Monday morning, I went to my office and began building, not a building, a case. The marriage lasted 8 months. I will not detail every fracture here because the fractures are not the story. They are merely the evidence that the story was always going to end the way it ended. What I will tell you is that the Celeste who had been, in Edinburgh, genuinely curious and self-aware and weary of her world, disappeared entirely within 3 months of the wedding. In her place was a woman who treated our home in Marylebone as an extension of the Harrington estate, who spent money with the casual velocity of someone who has never experienced its absence, and who referred to my work in front of people as Marcus's little architecture projects. You know how he loves his models. She said it with affection. That was the part that required the most architectural composure. In the 8th month of our marriage, she asked for a divorce. She told me on a Wednesday morning over coffee in the kitchen. She was measured and not unkind and clearly had prepared what she was going to say. She told me she did not think we were compatible. She told me she had been thinking about it for some time. She told me that the prenup made things simple, which she said as a comfort, as though the financial clarity was a gift she was giving me. I said, I'd like to discuss this properly, with both families present. She seemed mildly surprised. She had not expected this. She had expected, I believe, that he would do what he's asked. Both families, she said. I think it's appropriate, I said, given the circumstances, given the prenup. I think everyone who was involved in that process should be present when we discuss the outcome. A pause. She set down her coffee. That's reasonable, she said carefully. I'll speak to Daddy. She did. Gerald agreed immediately. Of course he did. He had the prenup, he had the lawyers. He had the documents signed with a drafting pencil by a man of modest ambitions. He had no reason not to be in the room. The meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon at Harrington House. Formal enough to be appropriate, domestic enough that Gerald was on his own ground. I called Arthur that evening. Saturday, I said. Harrington House, Wiltshire, 2 p.m. I'll have everything prepared, he said. What would you like me to bring? The trust summary, I said, the Meridian licensing register, the net worth certification from the Swiss auditors, and the letter from the Singapore firm confirming the Qtwo disbursement. A pause. All right, Arthur said, I'll bring a second copy as well for the table. Good, I said. I took the rotring from my pocket. I set it on the desk. I looked at it for a moment. Then I opened the gray moleskin to the first page of notes. The list of insults precisely recorded from the dinner at Harrington House to the engagement party toast to Dominic's WhatsApp message to the kitchen phone call to Marcus's little architecture projects. I read through it once. I closed the notebook. I put it in the briefcase next to the rotring. Everything was prepared. Harrington House on a cold February Saturday was exactly what it always was: enormous, immaculate, and performatively serious. The gravel driveway had been freshly raked. The bay windows of the main drawing room caught the flat winter light and gave nothing back. I arrived at 1:55 p.m. in my 4-year-old charcoal suit. No new clothes, no performance. I carried the briefcase in my left hand and the moleskin in the breast pocket of my jacket and the rotring in the inner pocket where it always lived. Gerald's housekeeper showed me to the drawing room. They were all there. Gerald at the fireplace, standing because he always stood when he wanted to communicate authority. Dominic on the sofa to the left, long-legged and casually arranged, scrolling his phone with the rehearsed indifference of someone who wants you to know they have better things to do. Clive the solicitor at the writing desk in the corner with a neat stack of documents, the prenup I assumed and its associated paperwork, and beside him, a younger associate who said nothing throughout and whose name I was never given. Celeste was on the sofa opposite Dominic. She was wearing a cream silk blouse and her hair was down, and she looked, I noticed, relieved. The particular relief of someone who believes a difficult thing is nearly over. Alina was not in the room. I would find out later that she had been asked to leave for the meeting. This detail, which I noted silently, told me a great deal about how Gerald had framed the afternoon. Marcus, Gerald extended his hand. His handshake was firm and brief and communicated, as it always did, that this was a courtesy rather than a warmth. Gerald, I shook it. Dominic glanced up from his phone long enough to say, "All right, mate," with the tone of someone managing an awkward tradesman. I sat down. I placed the briefcase at my feet. Gerald moved to his chair, the larger one naturally positioned slightly forward of the others, and settled into it with the ease of a man who has never once sat in a chair that was not designed for him. "I think we all understand why we're here," he said. "This is an unfortunate situation, but I'm glad we're approaching it like adults. The prenup is straightforward. Clive has everything prepared. I think we can conclude this quickly and with a minimum of unpleasantness." He looked at me with the expression of a planning committee chair reviewing a minor residential application. Celeste looked at her hands. Dominic put his phone away. "Before we begin," I said, "I'm expecting a colleague at 2 o'clock. I hope you don't mind." Gerald's brow moved fractionally. "A colleague, my solicitor, Arthur Vance. He should be here momentarily." A small pause. Clive and Gerald exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second. "Of course," Gerald said, recovering smoothly. "We're happy to wait." The doorbell rang at exactly 2 p.m. Arthur Vance entered the drawing room at 2:03 p.m., carrying a black leather document case and wearing an open-collar shirt beneath a navy suit jacket, and he shook Gerald's hand with the relaxed confidence of a man attending a meeting he has already won. He sat beside me. He placed the document case on the low table between us and the fireplace. He said nothing. Gerald looked at the document case, then at Arthur, then at me. "Shall we begin?" Gerald said. "Please," I said. Clive cleared his throat and began his summary of the prenuptial agreement. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. He covered the key clauses with efficient precision, pausing occasionally to check a page reference. He concluded by confirming that the document, as signed, was legally binding and that Marcus Webb's entitlements in the event of dissolution were clearly defined. When he finished, there was a short, satisfied silence in the room. Gerald looked at me. "I think that covers it. As I say, straightforward." Dominic exhaled slowly through his nose, the exhale of a man who has sat through an inconvenience that is now mercifully ending. I looked at Celeste. She was looking at her hands again. There was something in her posture, a very slight forward lean, a tension in the shoulders that I recognized as guilt. She knew, I think, that this was not a dignified process. She had the grace to feel something about it. I took the rotring from my inner pocket and set it on the table. Nobody reacted to this. Nobody understood yet what it meant. Before we proceed, I said, I'd like to make a few observations. I hope you'll indulge me. Gerald inclined his head, gracious in victory. You drafted this prenup, I said, to protect your family's assets from mine. You designed Clause 14, subsection 3, specifically to ensure that in the event of dissolution, I would retain only assets held exclusively in my name prior to the date of marriage. That's correct, Clive said. I want to confirm that I have no objection to that clause, I said. None whatsoever. In fact, I consider it entirely fair. A small pause. Gerald's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a barely perceptible recalibration, like a building registering the first tremor of something it hasn't accounted for. I'm glad to hear it, he said. I opened the briefcase. I took out the gray moleskin and placed it on the table. I did not open it yet. I'd like to read something first, I said, if you'll bear with me. I've been keeping notes. I opened the notebook to the first page. I read them the list. I started with Gerald's dinner table observation. The problem with architects today is that they have ideas and no grasp of capital. It's a servile profession masquerading as a creative one. Gerald's face became very still. I read Gerald's engagement party toast verbatim from my notes. Marcus is a steady and decent individual. A man of modest ambitions and genuine commitment. A good captain, I'm sure, for calmer seas. Dominic straightened on the sofa. I read Dominic's WhatsApp message. Has the architect signed his lovely little life away yet? I heard Celeste make a very small sound. I read the kitchen phone call word for word, including, he always does what he's asked. That's rather the point of him. Complete silence. I closed the notebook. I want you to have those words in mind, I said, for what comes next. I nodded to Arthur. Arthur opened the document case. He removed 4 items and placed them on the table in a row with the unhurried precision of a man laying out architectural drawings for a client review. First, the trust summary. 17 pages bound. Second, the Meridian Framework Licensing Register. 112 licensees across 29 countries. Third, the net worth certification from the Swiss auditors dated 6 weeks before the wedding. The figure at the bottom of page 1 was circled in Arthur's handwriting, $347,200,000. Fourth, the Singapore disbursement letter, $4.8 million. Quarterly royalty payment, cone of the current year. I let them sit on the table for a moment. Gerald stared at the net worth certification. He did not move, he did not speak, he simply stared. Dominic leaned forward and picked up the licensing register. He turned to the first page. He looked at the number of licensees. He set it down. Celeste looked at the Swiss certification. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at me. Her face when she looked at me was a document. I had been married to this woman for 8 months and I had known her for 7 years and I had never seen her face do what it did in that moment. The color drained from it first. Then came the understanding, not a slow dawn but a sudden, structural collapse, the expression of someone who has been standing in a building and has just realized in the space of a breath that every load-bearing wall has already been removed. She said, Marcus, these assets, I said calmly, all of them, every single one, were held exclusively in my name prior to the date of our marriage. As per Clause 14, subsection 3 of the prenuptial agreement that your father's solicitor drafted and that you asked me to sign. Under the terms of that agreement, which I signed voluntarily and in full understanding of its provisions, every asset in my trust is protected. All 349 million of it. None of it was ever at risk. I let that land. Then, you designed a document to protect your estate from a man of modest ambitions. You protected me from your money, and you left my money entirely untouched. Gerald's face had moved through stillness into something I had not seen on it before. A kind of naked, unmanaged shock. He looked 10 years older than he had 40 minutes ago. He looked like a man who has just seen the foundations of a building he believed to be solid develop a crack so fundamental that no repair is possible. Clive was very quietly reviewing the prenup. Dominic was sitting forward with both elbows on his knees, staring at the documents on the table with an expression that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has made a joke and only just understood that the punchline is about him. But, Gerald started, the prenup is exactly as you wrote it, Arthur said. His voice was even, pleasant, entirely without triumph. It is, as you noted, entirely fair. Marcus has no issue with it. He simply wanted you to understand what you were signing. You're Gerald stopped himself. An architect, I said. Yes, I build things. I've been building this one for 11 years. The Meridian Framework is licensed in 29 countries. It generates $4.8 million per quarter. The trust has been accumulating since I was 31. I don't discuss my finances publicly. I don't perform them for anyone. I simply build. Celeste pressed her fingers to her mouth. I looked at her. I felt nothing that could be called triumph. I want to be precise about that. I felt no satisfaction in her shock, no pleasure in Gerald's collapse. What I felt, sitting in that drawing room at Harrington House on a cold February Saturday, was the particular and profound sadness of a man who had loved someone real and lost her to a version of herself that had never deserved him. I picked up the rotring from the table. I held it for a moment, looking at it. Then I set it down again on top of the documents. A full stop, a closing signature on a structure I had been building for 6 weeks. I don't want anything from your estate, I said to Gerald. I never did. I want the divorce, which is straightforward under the terms of the agreement you drafted. I want it concluded quickly, quietly, and without theatrics. And I paused, I want you to understand that a man's worth is not determined by what the people in this room can see. I stood. Arthur stood beside me. Gerald sat where he was. He did not speak. He did not stand. Dominic was looking at the licensing register again. He was on page 3. He appeared to be counting something. I picked up my briefcase. I took the rotring from the table and put it back where it belonged, in the inner pocket of my jacket, against my chest. I said goodbye to no one in particular. I walked out of Harrington House into the flat February light and across the raked gravel to my car, and I drove back to London. The divorce was concluded in 11 weeks. Under the terms of the prenup exactly as written, I retained all assets held in my name prior to the marriage: the Meridian framework, the trust, the patents, the properties. The accounts in Zurich and Singapore and Seoul. Celeste received a settlement in accordance with the prenup, a lump sum from the Harrington family trust, the Marylebone flat which Gerald had purchased as a wedding gift and which was therefore a Harrington asset, and the return of all jointly titled items. She moved back to Kensington. Gerald Harrington, in the weeks following the meeting at Harrington House, faced a different kind of reckoning. The story of the meeting did not stay inside the drawing room. Stories never do in the circles Gerald operated in. By the time the account had reached his business partner on the board of his property investment firm, it had acquired the quality of a parable and not a flattering one. The man who had publicly dismissed his son-in-law as a man of modest ambitions, who had engineered a prenup designed to extract maximum financial protection, had been quietly and completely outmaneuvered by the very person he had dismissed. 2 of Gerald's property partners quietly withdrew from a joint venture that had been in planning for 14 months. The project stalled. Gerald did not speak publicly about the reasons. His social standing, which had always rested on the confidence of a man who has never been wrong in a room, developed a fissure that his carefully managed manner could not entirely repair. He was still invited to dinners. But the dinners were quieter around him. Dominic's consequence was simpler and, in some ways, more immediate. He had built his professional identity largely on the borrowed authority of the Harrington name and the unquestioned certainty that the family occupied the top of any room they entered. The meeting in Wiltshire removed that certainty in a way that nothing else had. He lost 2 client relationships at his consultancy in the 6 months that followed, clients who had, I was told, heard the story from people who knew the Harringtons, and who had drawn their own conclusions about the judgment of a family that had handed a man of such apparent consequence a document designed to do him financial harm. The WhatsApp message, "Has the architect signed his lovely little life away yet?" was, I understand, repeated to him by several people over the course of those months. He stopped finding it funny. Celeste returned to London and, by all accounts, did what people do when the world they were certain of stops making sense. She rebuilt. She took a position at a property consultancy, a real position with real responsibilities, not the honorary creative directorship she had previously occupied at her father's firm. She worked. I know this because Alina told me in a brief text message sent 4 months after the divorce was finalized that Celeste was doing better than you might expect. I believed it. I wanted it to be true. Clive submitted his invoice for the prenup work and received payment in full from the Harrington Family Trust. I'm told he did not send a Christmas card that year. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, 7 months after the divorce was finalized. It came in a plain white envelope handwritten in Celeste's careful, slightly formal script. No return address, no preamble. I will not reproduce it in full. But the essential meaning, which is the only part that matters, was this. She wrote that she was not writing to ask for anything. She wanted to be clear about that first. She wrote that she had spent 7 months thinking about the meeting in Wiltshire, not about the documents on the table, not about the number on the Swiss certification, but about the moment I had read from the gray notebook. She wrote that hearing her own words quoted back to her, precisely and without embellishment, had been the most uncomfortable experience of her life, more uncomfortable than the revelation of my net worth, more uncomfortable than the collapse of the story she had told herself about the marriage and who had been wronged by its ending. She wrote that she understood now that she had not married me. She had married a version of me that was small enough to be managed and contained and directed, a version that served the story her family had told itself. The actual me had been sitting in front of her for 7 years and she had not seen him because she had not been looking. She wrote, "I am sorry, not for the divorce, for Edinburgh. For who I was in Edinburgh and how much of it was real and how completely I left her behind." The letter contained no request, no phone number, no suggestion of anything further. I read it twice. I felt something soft move through me and then settle. I placed it in the top drawer of my drafting desk next to the gray moleskin. I did not reply, but I did not delete it. And there is something in that choice that I believe is the most important architectural decision of the entire story, not to let the weight of bitterness become load-bearing. People ask me, when they eventually learn the full story, what the lesson is. I tell them it is not about money. The money was never the point. The Meridian framework was not built as a weapon or a defense or a plan. It was built because I am an architect and architects build things, and because the problem of how buildings fail systemically seemed to me to be a problem worth spending 11 years solving. The money was the consequence of the work. It was never the work itself. What the Prenup story taught me is something I already knew from buildings and had failed to apply to people. You cannot assess the load-bearing capacity of a structure from its facade. You cannot look at a building's entrance and know what holds it up. The assessment requires going deeper. It requires methodology. It requires time. I assessed the Harrington family entirely from the facade. I saw Celeste's intelligence and her weariness and her questions in Edinburgh, and I concluded from those visible elements that she was built on foundations I respected. I did not go deeper. I did not do the survey. I loved the elevation and ignored the subsidence below. That is on me. That is the part I carry. The Harringtons made their own error, and it was a different one. They assessed me from the facade too, the old suit, the modest commissions, the quiet manner, the willingness to absorb without reacting, and they concluded that the visible elements represented the full structure. They did not consider that stillness is not the same as emptiness. They did not consider that the most stable buildings are often the quietest ones. No drama, no performance, no unnecessary movement. Just load-bearing certainty running deep below the surface where nobody thinks to look. A man of modest ambitions. Gerald was right in a way he did not intend and has perhaps since come to understand. My ambitions were modest. To build things that worked, to solve problems worth solving, to be known for my character rather than my balance sheet. These are modest ambitions in a world that measures worth in the currency of visibility and noise. But modest ambitions built on genuine foundations compound over time. That is the lesson the Meridian framework taught me at 26. It is the lesson that Harrington House confirmed at 41. I am today still an architect. I have a new commission in Seoul and another in Cape Town and a third in Rotterdam that I am particularly excited about, because the structural problem it poses is the most interesting one I have encountered in years. I have the Clerkenwell studio and the drafting table and the oak desk and the Rotring 600 that has been in my jacket pocket since I was 29. I also have $352 million in a trust that continues to grow quietly and without ceremony, because that is what stable structures do when their foundations are sound. I do not own a yacht. I have not bought a different suit. I do not need to. The story of Marcus Webb is not, ultimately, a story about a prenup. It is a story about what happens when people confuse the visible with the real. It is a story about the load-bearing walls that nobody sees. And it is a reminder, when I think about every time I sit at a drafting table and begin the slow, methodical work of understanding what holds something up, that the foundations are always there, whether or not you bother to look for them. Build on integrity, everything else is sand. The story of Marcus Webb is a powerful reminder that true wealth is not what you own, it is what you have built quietly over time when no one was watching. It reminds us that the people who underestimate us most completely are often the ones who looked most carefully and simply refused to look deep enough. Marcus's journey from a man dismissed as modest and manageable to the quiet architect of his own extraordinary life is a testament to the power of patience, precision, and foundations that run deeper than anyone suspects. We all face moments that test the load-bearing walls of our lives. The question is not whether those moments will come, they always do. The question is what you have built beneath the surface to meet them. What do you think? Was Marcus right to sign the prenup as written and let the reveal happen on his terms? Or should he have walked away before the wedding the moment he heard that phone call? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your perspective matters more than you know. If Marcus's story moved you, please show your support by giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more stories about quiet strength, unexpected foundations, and the moments when the truth finally surfaces. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.